Black nurse slaps idle heir's cheek. Her billionaire backstory stuns all onlookers. The sound of the slap echoed through the hospital corridor. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Margaret Johnson, a 65-year-old black nurse with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a neat bun, stood rigid, her hand still tingling from the impact. Across from her, William Preston, III, heir to the Preston real estate fortune, pressed his manicured fingers against his reddening cheek, his eyes wide with shock and indignation. "How dare you touch me?" William hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "Do you have any idea who I am? I'll have your job for this." Margaret didn't flinch. Her chin lifted slightly, dignity radiating from her worn but immaculate uniform. "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Preston. The question is, do you know who I am?" Security guards approached cautiously. Hospital administrators emerged from offices, smartphones already raised to record the confrontation. William's personal assistant frantically tried to usher him away from the growing crowd. "Your father built his empire on stolen land, my land," Margaret continued, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. "And now you have the audacity to refuse treatment to patients from my community because it might affect your precious property values." William's face contorted with fury. "Someone remove this woman immediately. I want her fired," and a tall, distinguished man in an expensive suit stepped forward from the crowd. The hospital board chairman, Dr. James Reynolds, raised his hand to silence William. "Actually, Mr. Preston," Dr. Reynolds said, his voice carrying clearly down the corridor, "you might want to reconsider. Mrs. Johnson here owns controlling interest in Preston development." Gasps rippled through the onlookers. William's face drained of color. "In fact," Dr. Reynolds continued, "she's the anonymous donor who just pledged $50 million to our new community health wing, the wing you were trying to block." Security guards exchanged uncertain glances, backing away slowly. William's assistant stood frozen, mouth agape, and Margaret Johnson, her head held high, simply straightened her uniform and turned toward the patient rooms. "Now, if you'll excuse me," she said quietly, "I have patients who need me. But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when Margaret Johnson arrived for her shift at Riverside Memorial Hospital, the same way she had for the past 42 years. Margaret parked her modest Toyota Camry in the staff lot of Riverside Memorial, the same spot she'd claimed for nearly 2 decades. The morning air held the crisp promise of autumn, and Margaret pulled her cardigan closer as she walked toward the employee entrance. The hospital had changed over the years, expanded, modernized, grown taller against the city skyline, but some things remained constant, like her dedication to this place and its patients. She nodded to the security guard at the door. "Morning, Frank. How's that grandbaby of yours?" Frank beamed, reaching for his wallet. "Growing like a weed, Ms. Johnson. Just turned 6 months yesterday." He proudly displayed a photo of a chubby-cheeked infant. "My goodness, she has your eyes," Margaret said with a warm smile. "Those Johnson women are going to break some hearts." These small moments of connection, these were the threads that had woven the tapestry of Margaret's life at Riverside. She knew the names of the maintenance staff, remembered which cafeteria worker was saving for their child's college tuition, kept track of which doctors had anniversaries approaching. In a place where life and death hung in fragile balance, Margaret believed these human connections mattered. The elevator carried her to the 3rd floor, pediatrics. Though she'd worked nearly every department in her long career, pediatrics had claimed her heart 15 years ago and hadn't let go. Margaret checked her watch as she approached the nurse's station, 10 minutes early as always. "Morning, sunshine," called Sophia Rodriguez, the night shift charge nurse. At 32, Sophia represented the new generation of healthcare workers, tech-savvy, quick-witted, and possessed of an energy that sometimes made Margaret's bones ache just watching her. "Good morning, Sophia. How was the night?" Sophia handed over a tablet with the patient charts. "Pretty standard." Jamie in 304 spiked a fever around 2 a.m., but it responded to medication. "Oh, and the Dia's baby finally kept down some formula. Mama's over the moon." Margaret nodded, scrolling through the updates. "And how about our new admission? The Thompson boy?" Sophia's expression clouded. "That one's breaking my heart, Margaret. 8 years old, advanced leukemia, transferred from county when his insurance finally came through. He's a fighter, though." Margaret made a mental note to stop by his room first. The new ones, especially the children, needed to know they weren't alone in this sterile, frightening place. "Oh," Sophia added as she gathered her belongings. "Administration called. There's some kind of board meeting today. VIPs expected on the floor for a tour." Margaret sighed. "Politicians or donors? Both, I think. Something about the new community health wing." Sophia shrugged into her jacket. Dr. Chen said to make sure everything's spotless. When is it not? Margaret replied with a raised eyebrow. After Sophia left, Margaret settled into her routine, reviewing charts, preparing medications, checking supplies. Then she made her rounds, visiting each young patient, some still sleeping in the early morning hours. She straightened blankets, adjusted pillows, checked IV lines with practiced hands. In room 312, she found Michael Thompson awake, his thin face ghostly in the dim light. Chemotherapy had already claimed his hair, but his eyes, large and dark, watched her with curious intensity. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," Margaret said softly, approaching his bed. "I'm Margaret, and I'll be your nurse today." The boy studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You're old," Margaret chuckled. "I prefer experienced." "Do experienced nurses know how to make the throwing up stop?" Margaret's heart squeezed. "Sometimes. We certainly try our very best." "How about we start with some ice chips for that dry mouth?" As she helped him with the ice, Margaret told him about the other children on the floor, the playroom down the hall, and the therapy dog that visited on Thursdays. Michael didn't smile, but the tension around his eyes eased slightly. "My mom had to go to work," he said abruptly. "She said she'd be back at lunch." Margaret nodded, understanding the complicated reality many families faced balancing work obligations with a child's illness, especially single parents like Ms. Thompson. "Well, until she returns, you've got me, and I've been told I'm excellent company." "Do you have kids?" Michael asked. A familiar pang touched Margaret's heart. "No, honey, but I've helped take care of thousands of children over the years, so in a way I have a very large family." The morning progressed with its usual rhythm: medications administered, vital signs recorded, doctors' rounds accompanied. Margaret moved through it all with the efficiency born of decades of practice. By 10 o'clock, the floor was fully awake, filled with the sounds of breakfast trays being collected, television cartoons, and the occasional cry from a younger patient. Margaret was changing an IV bag when her colleague, Denise, appeared in the doorway. "They're here," Denise whispered urgently. "The VIPs. And Margaret, you won't believe who's with them." Before Margaret could respond, voices approached from down the hallway, the distinctive tenor of Dr. Chen, the chief of pediatrics, mingled with the deeper baritone of Dr. Reynolds, the board chairman. And then another voice, one that made Margaret freeze in place. "Frankly, James, I don't see why the new wing needs to be located on the east side. It's going to decrease property values in the adjacent development by at least 15%. Margaret's hands stilled. That voice, cultured, entitled, dismissive, transported her instantly across decades. The voice of William Preston, I. "Mr. Preston," Dr. Reynolds was saying as the group appeared in the doorway, "the east side location makes the most sense for serving the communities with the greatest need." "The greatest need, perhaps, but the least ability to pay," William countered smoothly. From a business perspective, he stopped mid-sentence as his eyes fell on Margaret. For a moment, just a flicker across his handsome features, there was a spark of recognition. Then it vanished behind a mask of polite indifference. Dr. Chen, oblivious to the sudden tension, continued the introduction. "And this is one of our most experienced nurses, Margaret Johnson. Margaret has been with Riverside for over 40 years. William Preston barely inclined his head, his gaze already moving past her to survey the room. "Charming. Now about the proposed budget for this project." The group moved on, William's tall figure leading the way, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the hospital scrubs around him. Margaret remained rooted to the spot, her heart thundering against her ribs. William Preston, I, the son of the man who had destroyed her family's future. The grandson of the woman who had fired Margaret's mother from her housekeeping position when she became too ill to work. The Preston family, whose wealth had been built in part on land seized from black families in the 1960s through predatory lending practices and corrupt local officials. Land that included the 5 acres that should have been Margaret's inheritance. "Margaret," Denise touched her arm. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." In some ways, she had. "I'm fine," Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Just surprised to see a Preston showing interest in community health," Denise snorted. "Interest? He's been fighting this project for months. Word is he doesn't want those people coming to a hospital so close to his new luxury condos." Margaret's jaw tightened. "Those people?" "His words, not mine," Denise clarified quickly. "Anyway, Dr. Reynolds must have finally convinced him to at least tour the facility." Throughout the rest of the morning, Margaret found herself distracted by the knowledge that William Preston was somewhere in the hospital, potentially making decisions that would affect the very community she'd served for decades. The East Side, her neighborhood, had struggled with limited healthcare access for generations. The new wing would change lives, save lives. At noon, Margaret took her lunch break in the small courtyard garden, seeking fresh air and a moment of peace. The autumn sun warmed her face as she closed her eyes, trying to center herself. "Ms. Johnson?" She looked up to find Dr. Reynolds standing before her, his tall frame casting a shadow across the bench. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said. "Not at all, Dr. Reynolds." Margaret straightened, smoothing her uniform. "Please join me." He sat beside her, looking uncharacteristically troubled. "I noticed something earlier during the tour, when you and William Preston saw each other. There was tension." Margaret considered deflecting, then decided against it. Dr. Reynolds had always been fair, honest. "We've never actually met," she explained. "But our families have history." Dr. Reynolds waited, giving her space to continue. "My grandfather owned land on the east side, good land, 5 acres with a view of the river. Back in the 60s, William Preston II, using some questionable tactics and connections at City Hall, managed to acquire that land and dozens of other properties owned by black families in the area." Understanding dawned in Dr. Reynolds' eyes. "The Riverside Heights development," Margaret nodded. "My family fought it in court for years, but we didn't have the resources to continue. My father worked 2 jobs trying to pay legal fees. My mother cleaned houses, including the Preston mansion, ironically, until she became too sick." She looked down at her hands, strong hands that had comforted countless patients. "That land would have changed everything for us. My father had plans to build apartments, create generational wealth. Instead, the Prestons built luxury homes and made millions." Dr. Reynolds was silent for a long moment. "I had no idea, Margaret. I'm sorry." "It was a long time ago," she said, though they both knew such wounds never truly healed. "And yet here you are still serving this community." Dr. Reynolds shook his head in admiration. "Despite everything," Margaret smiled slightly. "Where else would I be? These are my people." Dr. Reynolds leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Margaret, there's something I think you should know. The board meets this afternoon to make the final decision on the east side wing. Preston is pushing hard to relocate it to the north side, which would make it inaccessible to the communities that need it most." "Can he do that? I thought the funding was already secured." "Most of it is, but we're still 50 million short, and the anonymous donor who promised that funding has been silent for weeks. Without it, Preston and his allies on the board could force a compromise." Margaret felt a chill despite the sunshine. "That can't happen, Dr. Reynolds. The east side has been promised this facility for years." He nodded grimly. "I know, I'm doing everything I can." After Dr. Reynolds left, Margaret sat motionless, thinking. The irony wasn't lost on her. Another Preston, another attempt to redirect resources away from her community, history repeating itself in a cruelly familiar pattern. "That won't be necessary," Larry said smoothly, opening his portfolio. "My client has every right to be here, as you'll soon understand." Dr. Reynolds raised a hand to forestall the security guard who had appeared at the door. "What is this about, Margaret?" Before she could answer, William stepped forward, recognition finally dawning in his eyes. "Wait, Johnson, Margaret Johnson." His face hardened. "You're Ruth Johnson's daughter, the housekeeper who tried to sue my family." "My mother," Margaret corrected him calmly, "worked for your family for 22 years. She cleaned your nursery, cooked your meals, and helped raise you. When she became ill with cancer, your grandmother dismissed her without severance or health benefits." Murmurs rippled through the room. William's expression darkened further. "Ancient history," he dismissed with a wave, "and irrelevant to today's business." "On the contrary," Larry interjected, removing documents from his portfolio and placing them on the table. "It's directly relevant. Dr. Reynolds, board members, allow me to introduce Margaret Johnson, the anonymous donor who pledged $50 million to the East Side Community Health Wing." A stunned silence fell over the room. William recovered first, his laugh sharp and disbelieving. "That's absurd. She's a nurse." "Yes, I am," Margaret agreed. "I'm also the majority shareholder in Pierce Innovation Holdings, which owns controlling interest in several technology patents developed in the 1990s. She allowed herself a small smile. "Including the microprocessor used in most medical monitoring equipment worldwide." Larry distributed copies of financial statements and ownership certificates to the astonished board members. "My client has maintained her anonymity for personal reasons, but feels that circumstances now warrant disclosure." Dr. Reynolds studied the documents, his expression shifting from confusion to amazement. "This is extraordinary, Margaret." "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Margaret's gaze remained fixed on William. "My parents taught me that true wealth isn't measured by what you have, but by what you give. After my father passed, I used my inheritance, what little remained after the Prestons took our land, to invest in a friend's struggling technology startup. Pierce Innovation, Dr. Reynolds realized, glancing at Larry. My college roommate, Margaret confirmed. He had the ideas, I had a little capital and a lot of faith. When the company went public in 1995, I could have retired, moved away, lived in luxury. But this community, the one the Prestons have repeatedly tried to undermine, is my home. William's face had grown increasingly pale. This is some kind of trick. I assure you it's not, Larry replied, handing him a particular document. In fact, Pierce Holdings acquired a significant portion of Preston Development shares over the past decade through various investment funds. Mrs. Johnson effectively controls approximately 37% of your company, Mr. Preston. The room erupted in exclamations and questions. William stared at the document, then at Margaret, shock giving way to fury. This is revenge, he spat. 30 years in the making. Margaret shook her head. Not revenge, justice, balance. She turned to address the entire board. The East Side Wing will provide critical health care access to thousands of families like mine once was. I am prepared to release the pledged $50 million immediately with one condition. The facility remains in its originally planned location, serving the community it was designed for. Dr. Reynolds stood, his decision clear in his expression. I believe we have our answer regarding the location issue, unless there are objections. He looked pointedly at William, who remained silent, seething. Then I propose we move directly to a vote. The meeting proceeded with a new energy. Margaret's revelation had shifted the dynamics dramatically. The vote to maintain the East Side location passed unanimously, with William Preston abstaining. His earlier opposition evaporated in the face of Margaret's financial leverage. As the meeting concluded, board members approached Margaret with congratulations and questions. She answered politely but briefly, uncomfortable with the attention her wealth had suddenly attracted. This was exactly why she had kept it private for so long. She didn't want to be treated differently, didn't want her work as a nurse overshadowed by her financial status. William Preston departed without speaking to anyone, his rigid back and clenched fists broadcasting his humiliation and rage. Larry squeezed Margaret's hand. You did well. Your parents would be proud. Thank you for keeping my secret all these years, she replied. It felt strange having it out in the open after so long. Will you retire now? You certainly don't need to keep working, Margaret smiled. And leave my patients, never. The money was never about not working, Larry. It was about having choices and helping others have choices too. Dr. Reynolds approached, still shaking his head in wonder. Margaret, I don't know what to say all these years. Nothing has changed, she assured him. I'm still the same nurse I was this morning. A nurse who happens to control a substantial investment portfolio and a major portion of Preston Development, he pointed out with a wry smile. Details, Margaret dismissed. She checked her watch. And speaking of nursing, my shift isn't over. I should get back to my patients. As she turned to leave, Dr. Reynolds asked, will you at least consider having your name on the new wing? After all, you're financing a significant portion of it. Margaret paused in the doorway. My mother's name, she said softly. The Ruth Johnson Community Health Center. She's the one who taught me to care for others. It would be an honor, Dr. Reynolds agreed. Margaret returned to the pediatric floor where life continued its urgent, precious rhythm regardless of board meetings and financial revelations. She checked on Michael first, finding him watching cartoons, his earlier distress seemingly forgot. Feeling better? She asked, checking his IV line. The throwing up stopped. He studied her face curiously. Did you get in trouble for yelling at that man? Margaret smiled. I didn't yell, and no, I'm not in trouble. Good, he was mean. Michael's attention drifted back to his cartoon, then snapped back to her. My mom called. She's bringing me a milkshake after work. That sounds wonderful. What flavor? Chocolate. Do you like chocolate? It's my favorite, Margaret assured him, making a note on his chart. Now, how about we check your temperature? The afternoon progressed normally, or as normally as possible given the extraordinary events of the day. Word traveled quickly through hospital staff channels, and Margaret noticed subtle changes in how some colleagues looked at her, spoke to her. It was exactly what she had feared and precisely why she had guarded her privacy so carefully. Around 5:30 p.m., as her shift neared its end, Denise rushed to find her. Margaret, you need to come quickly. It's Preston. He's on the floor again, and he's making a scene at the nurse's station. Margaret hurried down the corridor to find William Preston leaning over the desk, berating a young nurse whose eyes were filling with tears. A security guard stood nearby, clearly uncertain how to handle a hospital benefactor behaving badly. Mr. Preston, Margaret called as she approached. Is there a problem? He straightened, his handsome face flushed with anger or perhaps alcohol. Margaret detected the faint scent of whiskey as she drew closer. Ah, the secret billionaire returns to her humble calling, he sneered. How noble, how inspirational. The young nurse used his distraction to retreat, throwing Margaret a grateful look. You're causing a disruption on a patient floor, Margaret said evenly. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. William laughed bitterly. You're asking me to leave. Do you have any idea what you've done today? The damage to my reputation. The board members are already whispering behind my back. Your reputation was damaged by your own actions and attitudes, not by mine, Margaret replied. Now please lower your voice. There are sick children trying to rest. Don't lecture me about children, he snapped, loud enough that several nearby parents emerged from rooms to see what was happening. This hospital has bent over backward for the Preston family for generations. My grandfather's donations built the West Wing. My father funded the cardiac center. And those contributions are appreciated, Margaret acknowledged. But they don't entitle you to mistreat staff or violate patient privacy. William stepped closer, invading her personal space. You think you've won, don't you? The poor little nurse who outsmarted the rich white man. Is that how you see this? Margaret remained perfectly still, her expression neutral despite her racing heart. I see a man who inherited wealth and privilege, using it to block healthcare access for communities in need, and I see myself as someone with the means and responsibility to prevent that. Playing the race card, William scoffed. How predictable. This isn't about race, Mr. Preston. It's about right and wrong. It's about keeping promises to communities that have heard too many broken promises already. William's eyes narrowed. You've made an enemy today, Mrs. Johnson. I still have considerable influence in this city. I'm aware, Margaret replied calmly, but I've been facing down Prestons for 3 generations now. I'm not easily intimidated. Something in her steady gaze seemed to infuriate him further. He leaned in, voice dropping to a venomous whisper. Your kind always think you can rise above your station. My grandmother should have fired your mother the moment she started coughing up blood on our imported rugs. The cruel words hit Margaret like a physical blow. For a moment, she was a child again, watching her exhausted mother return home from the Preston mansion, trying to hide her illness, working until she literally couldn't stand. Around them, the corridor had grown deathly quiet. Staff and visitors stood frozen, witnessing the confrontation. From the corner of her eye, Margaret saw Dr. Reynolds approaching rapidly from the elevator bank. Mr. Preston, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the rage and pain boiling inside her. I've spent my life caring for the sick and vulnerable. I've held dying children in my arms and comforted parents through unimaginable loss. I've worked holidays and weekends and midnight shifts. I've given everything I have to this community. She stepped closer, meeting his gaze directly. Your grandmother fired my mother when cancer made her inconvenient. Your father stole land from dozens of black families to build his fortune. And now you want to deny health care to the very communities your family has exploited for generations. William's lips curled in a sneer. Spare me the self-righteous. The slap came before Margaret had even realized she would do it. Her open palm connected with William's cheek with a crack that echoed down the corridor. Heads turned. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. William Preston pressed his manicured fingers against his reddening cheek, his eyes wide with shock and indignation. How dare you touch me? William hissed, his voice trembling with rage. Do you have any idea who I am? I'll have your job for this. Margaret didn't flinch. Her chin lifted slightly, dignity radiating from her worn but immaculate uniform. I know exactly who you are, Mr. Preston. The question is, do you know who I am? Security guards approached cautiously. Hospital administrators emerged from offices, smartphones already raised to record the confrontation. William's personal assistant frantically tried to usher him away from the growing crowd. Your father built his empire on stolen land, my land, Margaret continued, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. And now you have the audacity to refuse treatment to patients from my community because it might affect your precious property values. William's face contorted with fury. Someone remove this woman immediately. I want her fired, and Dr. Reynolds stepped forward from the crowd, raising his hand to silence William. Actually, Mr. Preston, Dr. Reynolds said, his voice carrying clearly down the corridor, you might want to reconsider. Mrs. Johnson here owns controlling interest in Preston development. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. William's face drained of color. In fact, Dr. Reynolds continued, she's the anonymous donor who just pledged $50 million to our new community health wing, the wing you were trying to block. The security guards exchanged uncertain glances, backing away slowly. William's assistant stood frozen, mouth agape, and Margaret Johnson, her head held high, simply straightened her uniform and turned toward the patient rooms. Now, if you'll excuse me, she said quietly, I have patients who need me. Now back to where we started, in the aftermath of that fateful confrontation. The corridor slowly returned to normal activity as William Preston was escorted from the building by his assistant, his usual commanding presence diminished by shock and humiliation. Staff members cast awed glances at Margaret as she moved purposefully toward Michael Thompson's room, determined to check on him one last time before her shift ended. She found him sitting up in bed, his mother beside him, both enjoying the promised chocolate milkshakes. "Ms. Johnson," Michael brightened when he saw her. "Mom brought an extra milkshake. Do you want it?" Tamika Thompson, a young woman with tired eyes but a warm smile, extended a paper cup. "Please take it. Michael told me how you stood up for him earlier." Margaret accepted the simple gift with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, that's very kind. Is everything okay?" Tamika asked, glancing toward the corridor. "We heard some commotion." "Everything is fine now," Margaret assured her, checking Michael's vital signs one last time. "And more importantly, someone's looking much better this evening." Michael nodded eagerly. "Mom says if my counts are good tomorrow, we can go to the playroom." "That sounds like an excellent plan." Margaret made a final note on his chart. "I'll see you tomorrow, Mr. Thompson. Rest well." As she turned to leave, Tamika followed her into the hallway. "Ms. Johnson, I wanted to thank you properly. Michael told me what that man said about him being a drain on resources." Her voice caught slightly. "We've faced that attitude before at County. It's why I fought so hard to get him transferred here." Margaret touched the younger woman's arm gently. "You did the right thing, and I promise you Michael will receive the best care possible at Riverside." "The nurse at the station said something about you being wealthy." Tamika looked confused. "And donating money for a new wing?" Margaret smiled. "It's a long story, but yes, there will be a new community health center on the east side, the Ruth Johnson Center named for my mother." "East side, that's our neighborhood." Tamika's eyes widened. "That would change everything for families like ours." "That's the hope," Margaret agreed. "No more long bus rides for basic care. No more choosing between a day's wages and a doctor's appointment." Tamika studied her with new understanding. "You could be anywhere doing anything. Why stay here working these long shifts?" It was a question Margaret had asked herself many times over the years, especially on the hardest days, the days when young patients didn't recover, when families received devastating news, when her back ached and her feet throbbed from 12 hours on the floor. "This is where I'm needed," she said simply. "Where I can make a difference face to face, one patient at a time." After saying goodbye to Tamika, Margaret completed her shift handover and gathered her belongings from the staff locker room. The events of the day had left her drained but resolute. As she walked toward the exit, she found Dr. Reynolds waiting near the doors. "I thought you might try to slip away quietly," he said with a knowing smile. "Just heading home after my shift like any other day," Margaret replied. "Except it's not like any other day, is it?" Dr. Reynolds fell into step beside her as they walked toward the parking lot. "The board is ecstatic, by the way. The funding has already been transferred, and construction on the Ruth Johnson Center will begin next month." Margaret nodded, satisfaction warming her despite her exhaustion. "Good, that's good. The press will want to talk to you," Dr. Reynolds warned. "The nurse who slapped a Preston and turned out to be his boss, it's quite a story." "I'm not interested in publicity," Margaret said firmly, "and I regret losing my temper regardless of the provocation." Dr. Reynolds chuckled. "Well, I can't officially condone physical confrontation, but between us, it's been a long time coming." They reached Margaret's modest Toyota, parked in the same spot it had occupied that morning, though the woman who had arrived in it was forever changed in the eyes of the world. "Will you still come to work tomorrow?" Dr. Reynolds asked, suddenly serious. "No one would blame you if you wanted to take some time or even retire." Margaret finished for him. She smiled, unlocking her car door. "I'll be here at 7, same as always. My patients are expecting me." Dr. Reynolds nodded, a mixture of respect and wonder in his expression. "The hospital is lucky to have you, Margaret Johnson, in more ways than we ever realized." As Margaret drove home through familiar streets past the neighborhoods where she had grown up, past the vacant lot where the new health center would soon stand, she felt a curious sense of peace settling over her. The secret she had carried for so long had finally been revealed, not for personal gain or recognition, but in service to the community she loved. Her modest house welcomed her with its familiar comfort, photos of her parents on the mantel, books lining the shelves, simple furniture worn with use. Margaret had never felt the need to display her wealth through possessions. Her richest treasures were the lives she had touched, the difference she had made. She prepared a simple dinner, ate while watching the evening news, and prepared for bed with the same routine she had followed for decades. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, publicity to manage, perhaps, and certainly adjustments in how others perceived her. But the core of who she was remained unchanged. As she drifted toward sleep, Margaret thought of her mother, Ruth Johnson, who had cleaned the Preston mansion for 22 years, who had taught her daughter the value of education, hard work, and compassion, who had died without seeing justice served but had planted the seeds of that justice in her daughter's determined heart. "We did it, Mama," Margaret whispered into the darkness. "We finally did it." The Ruth Johnson Community Health Center opened its doors 18 months later, a gleaming facility that brought state-of-the-art healthcare to a community that had been medically underserved for generations. Margaret attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony but declined to speak, preferring to stand at the back of the crowd as Dr. Reynolds and city officials made their remarks. William Preston was conspicuously absent, though rumors circulated that Margaret's financial team had negotiated a settlement that left the Preston family's public reputation intact while securing their cooperation with community development initiatives. Michael Thompson, now in remission and back in school, was invited to cut the ribbon alongside the mayor. His mother, Tamika, had been hired as the center's community outreach coordinator, a position Margaret had quietly suggested creating. As for Margaret herself, she continued working her regular shifts at Riverside Memorial, caring for patients with the same dedication and compassion she always had. Some things had changed. She now served on the hospital board and had established a scholarship fund for minority nursing students. But in the ways that mattered most, Margaret Johnson remained true to herself and her calling. Her wealth, once a carefully guarded secret, became a tool for positive change in the community that had shaped her. And the story of the nurse who slapped an heir and transformed a neighborhood became an inspiration to others fighting seemingly insurmountable odds. In the end, Margaret's most profound legacy wasn't her financial success or even the health center bearing her mother's name, but the example she set, that true power comes not from what you possess, but from how you serve, not from status or title, but from the courage to stand up for what's right, even when standing alone. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.